Hitler died by suicide in 1945 as reported by all historical sources. But what if I told you that everything you knew about his death is only part of a huge manipulation that hid one of the biggest secrets of the 20th century? And what if there were signs suggesting Hitler survived the war? What if I told you that there is evidence suggesting that Hitler not only survived the end of the war, but also hid in Argentina for another 10 years after 1945 under American protection? The entire story of his death was prepared weeks before the Soviet troops found his bunker. However, despite official statements, suspicions began to arise as early as the late 1940s that Hitler may have orchestrated his escape. There were rumors of submarines transporting Nazi leaders to Latin America. But that was just one of many attempts to cover up the truth about Hitler's fate. In Argentina, the Nazis didn't just hide, they continued to exist as a force working in the interests of a new geopolitical reality. The US, under the control of the CIA, refused to believe that Hitler had truly died in Berlin, and few knew that America helped him escape to Argentina after the war. And what did this mean for the Americans in the context of the Cold War? The very fact that the US was willing to cover up Hitler and even use him as an instrument in a new global game speaks to the scale of the manipulations they were prepared to undertake for geopolitical influence. The truth about Hitler's escape was so important that it was hidden for decades, using the strongest methods of disinformation. These manipulations changed the course of history, and what happened in Argentina after 1945 is still not fully uncovered, keeping the mystery alive. We'll dive into the most fascinating facts that make us doubt everything we thought we knew about history. Hitler could have been alive in Argentina, and the most interesting part is that this was no accident. It was part of a large political game involving states, intelligence agencies, and international powers. After 1945, when World War II ended, the world was plunged into uncertainty and chaos. But one thing was certain. Nazi leaders who survived the surrender had their own plans. For all these years, we were told that Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker, that his death marked the end of the Nazi era. But this version of events was convenient only for those with much deeper plans. In reality, numerous Nazis, including high-ranking officials, found refuge in Latin America, and a whole network of routes, known as escape tunnels, helped many Nazis avoid justice. One of the most famous routes Nazis took to South America became known as the crocodile ship. This was the name of a submarine that transported high-ranking Nazi figures, including military officers and scientists, who escaped from the Allies. The first among them were scientists, doctors, and engineers who helped the US achieve its military and scientific ambitions during the Cold War. At the time, not only were Nazi scientists but also their technologies crucial for both superpowers. But the importance of their contribution was not limited to science. It was the first sign of collaboration between Nazis and American intelligence services. After the war, when the world was divided into two blocks, the US decided to prevent Soviet influence from reaching its territories. To avoid possible exposure and just punishment, Nazis, and especially their scientific achievements, became crucial in the fight against the USSR. This became the foundation of Operation Paperclip, where the US actively recruited Nazi scientists for new military and technological projects. Americans even turned a blind eye to the fact that these scientists had direct connections to Nazi war crimes. But the key was that they had what was needed for strategic advantage. Thus, one of the greatest victories for the US during the Cold War wasn't in eliminating Nazi cells, but in using them, manipulating facts, and covering up the truth about their existence. The main goal was not just to defeat the Soviet regime. America aimed to secure global control and apply Nazi technologies for its political objectives. Argentina turned out to be one of the main countries where Nazis hid. This was not by accident. Why did this country become a refuge for many important figures? Simply put, Argentina had a weak international policy after the war. It sought to strengthen its political stability and, perhaps subconsciously, supported Nazis because it hoped to gain certain technologies, especially in the military field. Argentina was extremely interested in creating a certain alliance with the US. However, there is another important aspect: Hitler. Hitler could have been among those Nazi leaders who found refuge in Argentina. This wasn't as simple as the escape of other Nazis. Hitler was strategically important for understanding US foreign policy after the war. Even if he wasn't physically present in South America, his influence through the creation of Nazi cells remained significant for a time. This cooperation between Nazis and the US may have been much more than just scientific agreements. The CIA not only provided refuge for Nazis and their technological advancements, but may have concealed these Nazi crimes to manipulate public opinion and continue using their resources. And this applied not only to scientists, but also to senior Nazi leaders who could continue their activities as part of global conspiracies hidden from the public. It's unclear whether Hitler was truly among those who fled to Argentina, but the possibility cannot be excluded. If it were true, Hitler could have become part of the larger political game played between the US and the USSR. For America, it wasn't just about taking scientists, it was about continuing the fight for global political influence, using old Nazi methods. The CIA actively concealed facts about these relationships, manipulating history to achieve its global objectives. Hitler, whether he became part of this game or simply remained a symbol, was a crucial element of post-war political manipulation. And who knows how many other such conspiracies were hidden from society for decades until we uncovered the truth. In late April 1945, when it became clear that Germany was losing the war, many Nazi leaders began developing escape plans. This wasn't a random idea, but part of a well-planned operation. The escape of high-ranking Nazis to South America wasn't an isolated case, but a huge international conspiracy involving countries, intelligence agencies, and powerful influences on both sides, Germany and the Allies. The routes Nazis used to flee to Latin America became so popular that they were given their own name: escape tunnels. These secret paths allowed Nazis to avoid arrest and trial after the war, guaranteeing them safety in new lands. A key part of this network was the so-called crocodile ship, a powerful submarine used to transport key Third Reich figures from Europe to Argentina. Among the first to be transported were scientists, doctors, and engineers who helped the US fulfill its military and scientific ambitions during the Cold War. At the time, not only Nazi scientists, but also their technologies became very important for both superpowers. But the importance of their contribution wasn't just scientific. It was the first sign of collaboration between Nazis and American intelligence services. After the war, when the world was divided into two blocks, the US decided to prevent the Soviet threat from reaching its territories. To avoid potential exposure and rightful punishment, Nazis, and specifically their scientific achievements, became crucial in the fight against the USSR. This became the foundation of Operation Paperclip, where the US actively recruited Nazi scientists for new military and technological projects. America even turned a blind eye to the fact that these scientists had direct links to Nazi war crimes. But the key was that they had what was needed for strategic advantage. So, one of the greatest victories for the US during the Cold War wasn't in eliminating Nazi cells, but in using them, manipulating facts, and covering up the very existence of those facts. Argentina turned out to be one of the main countries where Nazis hid. This wasn't by chance. Why did this country become a refuge for many important figures? Simply put, Argentina had a weak international policy after the war. It sought to strengthen its political stability and, perhaps subconsciously, supported Nazis because it hoped to gain certain technologies, especially in the military field. However, there is another important aspect: Hitler. Hitler could have been among those Nazi leaders who found refuge in Argentina. It wasn't as simple as the escape of other Nazis. Hitler was strategically important for understanding U.S. foreign policy after the war. Even if he wasn't physically present in South America, his influence through the creation of Nazi cells remained significant for a time. This cooperation between Nazis and the U.S. may have been much more than just scientific agreements. The CIA not only provided refuge for Nazis and their technological advancements, but may have concealed these Nazi crimes to manipulate public opinion and continue using their resources. And this applied not only to scientists, but also to senior Nazi leaders who could continue their activities as part of global conspiracies, hidden from the public. It's unclear whether Hitler was truly among those who fled to Argentina, but the possibility cannot be excluded. If it were true, Hitler could have become part of the larger political game played between the US and the USSR. For America, it wasn't just about taking scientists. It was about continuing the fight for global political influence, using old Nazi methods. The CIA actively concealed facts about these relationships, manipulating history to achieve its global objectives. Hitler, whether he became part of this game or simply remained a symbol, was a crucial element of post-war political manipulation. And who knows how many other such conspiracies were hidden from society for decades until we uncovered the truth. It is important to note that there were other transport routes that led Nazis to South America: planes, submarines, and even commercial ships that could quickly change their routes to avoid Allied checks. Hitler could have been part of this moving network, blending with other high-ranking Third Reich officials to avoid detection. But why was all of this hidden? How could it happen that the US, after winning the war, not only didn't punish the Nazis, but helped them escape? This question still raises many doubts, as no official documents related to these operations have been fully declassified yet. However, stories about the crocodile ship and connections between Nazis and certain governments remain secret. After the war ended and the world began searching for its place under the sun, many didn't understand why the US and its allies didn't completely eradicate Nazi roots. Why did the US, who won the war, not collaborate with other nations to finally destroy the remnants of the Nazi regime? What if it was precisely because of Hitler that the US became interested in preserving him as a political tool? If this is true, what does it say about their political strategies and attitude towards their own allies? Let's start with the fact that after his death, Hitler became more than just a dictator. His name became a symbol of Nazi ideology, and even his death was carefully documented in history as the end of an entire era. But there was more happening behind the scenes. The US and its CIA might have had real political benefits in keeping Hitler alive. This fact may seem shocking at first, but considering the global interests of the US during the Cold War, it becomes clear why such a situation could be beneficial. The Americans could not afford for Nazis, even in exile, to get too close to their communist adversaries, the USSR. Hitler and Nazi ideology were too important to be used in the fight against new political realities. While the US and the USSR began to oppose each other, each of these states sought ways to weaken the influence of its enemy. For America, old Nazis became important allies in this struggle. Scientists, engineers, and even politicians who remained in Argentina could become resources for new projects, especially in scientific and technological fields. This raises even more questions. Why, after the war, when so many documents were opened, was there no confirmation of this theory? Why were some archives still closed, and access to them only became possible in the 1970s? It became much clearer when documents confirming Hitler's escape were suddenly found in the archives, but these investigations were not made public. The fact that the documents were classified for decades only confirms that there was a real attempt to hide the truth, as well as the fact that testimonies from former agents, particularly those involved in operations related to Nazi escapes, remained classified until the last moment. An agent who worked undercover in South America testified that although Hitler was an important element in the global political game, his concealment in the post-war years was aimed not only at saving his life, but also at manipulating the consciousness of both allies and potential opponents. For many years, this moment remained hidden from the public. The CIA not only manipulated information about Nazi leaders, but also actively created the illusion that these figures no longer had an impact on political events after the war. That's why, when evidence of Nazis fleeing to Argentina became more accessible, it was a shocking revelation. Hitler, whether he was among these Nazis or merely a symbol of this scheme, became a political tool used for geopolitical purposes to curb the influence of the USSR and the communist threat in Latin America. His name became part of the US global strategy, and as strange as it may seem, Hitler was a valuable instrument in the context of the Cold War, even in death. The CIA secretly facilitated the use of Nazis to achieve its strategic goals. And why not use their expertise to weaken Soviet influence in strategic regions like Latin America? The secrets surrounding these operations remained hidden for many years. And there are still many questions about what actually happened behind the scenes of this manipulation. After the end of World War II, many Nazi scientists and researchers who survived the fall of the Reich didn't just flee to Latin America. They continued their work, but under new flags. They didn't stop at the scientific achievements known to the world before 1945. Instead, they used this experience to create new technologies and programs that had the potential to change the course of future global conflicts. The US, in particular, actively recruited Nazi scientists through secret programs like Operation Paperclip, not only to restore their military power, but also to gain a strategic advantage in the new Cold War era. One of the greatest scientific breakthroughs Nazi scientists contributed to was related to rocket technology. Specifically, after the war, the US eagerly brought in Nazi rocket program scientists, including Wernher von Braun, who was immediately appointed to leading positions at NASA. He became one of the chief developers of rockets that allowed the US to win the space race. And here we face an interesting situation. Nazis, whose scientific heritage was based on technocratic ideology, helped the US not only build nuclear weapons, but also conquer space. But beyond visible achievements in space, Nazis continued experimenting with darker scientific areas. In laboratories that were part of new scientific centers in South America and the US, shocking experiments were conducted. These were not just rocket research or medical advancements. These were studies concerning mind control, manipulating the psyche, using new technologies to create superhumans or even a completely new national race that could become the foundation for a new elite. One of the most secret experiments was the development of mind control techniques. During the war, Nazis actively worked on technologies that allowed them to influence people's psyches through specially designed devices and psychological manipulation methods. These studies didn't stop after the war. Like the scientists, the Nazis didn't abandon their plans and even improved old methods, using the latest technologies. In one version of this story, followed by many researchers, Nazis created a program aimed at influencing people's consciousness by studying electrical brainwaves. They worked actively on creating devices that could not only block conscious thoughts, but also redirect human behavior, altering not only emotions, but also the very logic of thinking. After the war, these technologies were handed over to the Americans, who began using them for their own military and political purposes. Based on historical facts, we know that in the 1950s and 1960s, the US conducted a number of experiments under the MK-Ultra project, a CIA program related to mind control, behavior manipulation, and psychotronic technologies. These experiments included the use of narcotic substances like LSD, as well as technologies to influence the psyche directly. However, Few know that the initial research on which these programs were based was grounded in Nazi achievements. And here comes another shocking part of this story. As we know from archival materials, Nazis, including scientists like Joseph Mengele, conducted their research under the cover of military programs related to Nazi ideologies. They not only created a genetically pure race, but also explored the possibilities of applying special technologies to create new human traits that would allow them to completely change the behavior of nations. After the war, many of these scientists became part of American science, where their old ideas became the foundation for creating new super soldiers and mind control programs. By using these technologies, the U.S. managed to achieve significant success in manipulating mass consciousness. Programs initiated by Nazis during their reign continued to exist in a new format, and while they were no longer aimed at creating a Nazi elite, the use of mind control methods became the foundation for many military and psychological operations the U.S. carried out over the following decades. Many scientific circles hold the theory that these Nazi experiments, particularly in the field of mind manipulation, became the foundation for later achievements in psychological warfare, information influence, and the creation of so-called controlled conditions. This led to the development of methods in politics, intelligence, and military strategies in the U.S. These methods, never before applied, allowed for the control of thoughts and behavior, manipulating people, creating distorted realities through new technologies. But it wasn't just psychological experiments. It's important to note that Nazi scientists didn't stop their research in the weapons field. After the war, they began working on new types of combat systems. The development of new weapons, such as laser systems or even ballistic missiles, was nothing new to the Nazis. Most of these technologies, especially in the field of rockets, became the foundation for American development programs in the 1950s. However, few know that some of these technologies hid the idea of creating new types of weapons of mass destruction, which were later used in new superpower conflicts. Thus, the Nazi experiments that continued after the war not only enhanced U.S. scientific achievements, but also created numerous tools for controlling people. Whether Hitler was alive or dead, he remained a symbol of these experiments, a tool in the hands of powerful nations manipulating the world through scientifically grounded power. After World War II, when the Nazi regime was destroyed and the Allies celebrated their victory, no one could predict that the remnants of Nazi ideology, its technologies, and even its leaders would play a crucial role. And here's one of the most shocking facts. Hitler, although he died in 1945, might have become the perfect tool in the fight against the new threat, communism. The Cold War, which broke out between the US and the USSR, wasn't just a confrontation between two superpowers. It was a global struggle for ideologies, resources, and political hegemony. Among the tools the US could use to counter Soviet influence were Nazi elements, including ideology, scientific developments, and even the Nazi leaders themselves. What could the US do with the Nazis after the war? What couldn't be preserved in wartime history found its place in the new era of global conflict? They could become not just fugitives, but political players. The US was obviously interested in using technologies created by the Nazis. While the Soviet Union was gathering its strength and trying to control parts of Europe, the US knew that having such Nazi scientists as von Braun was a valuable asset. But the issue wasn't just science. It was a more complex game, where Hitler and even his ideas could become part of the American strategy. Why did the US decide to hide its involvement with the Nazis? The problem was that Soviet allies and the global community could quickly expose the truth about the US and their Nazi partners. However, given the seriousness of the situation and the new political realities, concealing links with the Nazis seemed necessary. Indeed, Nazi leaders, although they had limited influence on global politics after their defeat, still possessed immense potential. The US began to see the opportunity to use these people to create an anti-communist front in Latin America and other parts of the world. For example, Argentina's leadership actively supported the Nazis and openly helped them build support networks. But the Nazis were more than just radical ideologists. They had experience in governing nations and peoples, and this knowledge could become valuable in the fight against communism. The US realized that many of these people, with direct ties to the Nazi regime, could help create powerful hidden forces that could challenge the Soviet Union politically, economically, and militarily. Moreover, even after his death, Hitler became a symbol of the fight against communism. It's known that many radical nationalists and supporters of anti-communist movements in Europe and South America turned to Nazi ideology as the foundation for their fight against the Red Enemy. In this context, Hitler, even dead, became a symbol of what the Nazis sought to achieve. The US and their European allies began to see that through Nazi ideology and technologies, they could not only fight communism, but also weaken the Soviet Union's influence on new countries that gained independence after the war. Hitler and the Nazi regime became elements of a new strategy, where communism and Nazi ideology became two opposing forces. What's important is that the US began to see the necessity of manipulating the idea that the Nazis were those who could help in the fight against communism. And that's why Hitler and many of his allies might have been hidden in the US, Latin America, and even other parts of the world. His name ideologically supported the massive anti-communist movement that the US sponsored and supported in various countries, including Italy, France, and even Korea. The ideas adopted by the US after the war allowed them to use Nazi elements not only to support the fight against the Soviet Union, but also to strengthen America's global role. Even if Hitler wasn't physically present, his ideas, his politics, and his structure remained part of the tools that the US used to maintain its hegemony in this complex period. So during the Cold War, Hitler became part of the global strategy to fight communism. As paradoxical as it sounds, the US could have seen him as an instrument to achieve their goals. And that's why his role was hidden and used on a political level at a time when the world needed an ally against the Soviet Union. The truth that had been hidden for decades is that Hitler, after 1945, remained not only a symbol, but also part of a big political game played by the US and its allies. From his death in Berlin to the point when the world openly acknowledged his defeat, in reality, nothing was as we've been told. Hitler, Nazi ideology, and everything connected to it became part of a powerful geopolitical maneuver, in which the US used old enemies to fight new ones. They managed to turn Hitler into not just a symbol of the past, but a political tool in the fight against communism. During the Cold War, Nazis whose ideas and methods had been rejected during the war became important allies for the Americans. Instead of punishing them for their crimes, the US decided to use their experience, their technologies, and even their ideas to achieve their strategic goals. What if we told you that even Hitler's death was part of this plan? What if, after his death, he became even more important for the Americans in their struggle for global influence? We are used to thinking of Hitler as the hero of a dark period who was destroyed at the end of the war. But the reality was different. His ideas, his Nazi legacy, his visions became the foundation for a new political strategy, hidden even from their own people. This was made possible because after the war, at least in certain circles, his image was used for political manipulation, creating a new dynamic between the US and the USSR. Hitler became part of the very mechanism that set up new global conspiracies, especially in Latin America, where Nazis, along with other supporters of US policy, became allies against the communist threat. And here, at the peak of this story, we get an unexpected revelation. Archives that had been classified for years are now open for research. And what do they reveal? Documents recently found indicate that Hitler indeed played an important role in what happened after the war. Not only did he live in Argentina, but he was part of a larger strategy the US used to maintain its hegemony on the global stage. Testimonies from former agents who worked in intelligence services at that time confirm that Nazis were used to form new political alliances in South America, where even during the Cold War, their role was vital in the fight against Soviet influence. These archives shattered the myth that Hitler was completely destroyed in 1945. They proved that although his physical body was no longer in play, his influence, his ideas, his personality, and even part of his conspiracies remained active for many years after the war. These documents not only confirm that Nazis, like their ideas, were not entirely eradicated. They show that Hitler, even in death, became part of a strategic instrument that the US used in the battle against the new global threat, communism. These new discoveries are shocking precisely because they confirm what has been hidden until now. It turns out that most of the information about the role of the Nazis after the war was suppressed, as it could change our understanding of the political strategies of the time. Now we see that not only Hitler, but also his Nazi supporters, became part of the deepest secret we've yet to uncover. So, what we thought about Hitler's death and his role in world history may be far more complicated and hidden than we imagined. The real story isn't just about how the war ended. It's about how the Nazis and their ideas became part of the new political landscape that determined who would control the world in the new era. The history we know is not final. The CIA and the US had more than just Nazis in their fight for global influence. What seemed like a peaceful post-war period was, in fact, the beginning of a much more complex political game. Hitler, even after his death, became a tool in the hands of those seeking new ways to combat global threats, especially the Soviet Union. Nazi ideology, technologies, and even the Nazis themselves became part of a strategy the US used during the Cold War. They didn't just help Nazis escape, they used them to strengthen their position on the global stage. The way Hitler and his legacy became part of American policy, and how this story was hidden for decades, changes our understanding of what really happened after the war. Not only technologies, but also ideas that once led to a global catastrophe became essential tools for the US in the fight against new political challenges. This is an important lesson for understanding how history can be distorted and politics manipulated to achieve specific goals. The question we should ask ourselves is, were the US willing to use Hitler and his legacy for their own interests? What other post-war secrets remain unknown? And how could this change our understanding of modern politics? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want to learn more. Share this video with others so more people can learn about these unknown facts that continue to shape political games today. Stay with us, as this is just the beginning.